Hello, I'm Joni Brennan of the IEEE Standards Association, and I'm the technology evangelist for the IEEE Standards Association for Identity and Trust. Today, I'm here to welcome you to the IEEE Internet Initiative live panel, where we will be discussing algorithmic access control and algorithmic decision making. We'll touch upon some high-level issues, and we have some great guests today who will are from the identity management field of expertise. So we will cover the panelists' views on both technical and policy with regard to algorithmic access control. And we'll hear a bit more about their personal views with regard to design principles and how algorithmic access control might impact our everyday lives. Before we begin, I wanted to mention a few words about our sponsors, the IEEE Internet Initiative. The IEEE Internet Initiative provides a platform to connect the voice of the technical communities to global policy making for internet governance, cybersecurity, and privacy. This is done to inform debate and decision making and to help ensure trustworthy technology solutions and best practices are developed. All of the positions, all of the comments expressed here today are that of the panelists, their personal views, and not made on behalf of IEEE or the family of IEEE organizations in any way. If you are interested to learn more about the IEEE Internet Initiative, you can visit internetinitiative.ieee.org, and you can find out more about that activity. Now, we have four excellent panelists today from industry, and we've actually slated 90 minutes for the discussion. We're hopeful that we will have some time to work through any Twitter comments or questions that those of you viewing might have. And underneath my name, you will see IEEE Net Policy as the hashtag. So if you do have questions or would like to provide some commentary, please use that hashtag, and we'll try to respond to your questions the best that we can. So with that, we welcome you all today, and we welcome our panelists, and we'll move on to the show. So what I'd like to do is actually have our panelists each introduce themselves. But before we do that, I just want to mention algorithmic access control is a topic that's been coming up more and more, at least in my personal experience, around identity management, around the different services and tools that we use. So if you think of things like FitBits, mobile phones, connected cars, smart clothes, all of these devices and services have the ability to collect information about us, the users, the entities, and things that are occurring through these services and devices. More and more, algorithmic access control is this decision making that happens in real time. And so we'd like to understand these scenarios a little bit better. We'd like to ask some questions about who is responsible if the decisions made by the algorithms, let's say perhaps a death might result in those decisions. Who is actually liable in these cases? How can are there appropriate controls that we might want to think about as different stakeholders within a broad community with regard to algorithmic access control? So we won't come to any conclusions today. We will not be able to solve any issues that we identify, and it's very possible that solutions exist that we do not cover today. We recognize this is a broad and expansive community. What we do wish to do is introduce the topic, have a high-level discussion, and hopefully spur your thoughts on as well for those of you watching. So with that said, we'll move on to introducing our panel. And what I'd like to do is actually ask you guys, each of our panelists, and I will call you by name, I would like you to each introduce yourselves and just please tell me kind of one key area of interest why this topic of algorithmic access control is important for you. So let's start with Anna Slomovic. If you'll please introduce yourself, and if you'll please tell us a little bit about why this topic is important for you and your studies.
Hi, thank you, Joni. I'm Anna Slomovic. I've been doing privacy work for about 15 years, mostly as a corporate CPO. I've been interested in algorithms and algorithmic decision making for quite a long time. Obviously, algorithms are not new. My last job was as Chief Privacy Officer of Equifax, one of the credit bureaus. And of course, credit bureaus have been doing algorithmic scoring of creditworthiness for many, many years. My personal focus is on privacy and civil liberties issues, especially as algorithms move into much, much broader use and touch different aspects of our lives that they didn't touch before.
Thanks so much, Anna. And for those of you watching, we lost Anna's video feed, so I'm hopeful we'll actually get that back as we move through the panel. But thank you for letting us know, Anna, why this topic is important for you and some of the work that you've done in the space. Very appreciated. So next, I'd like to hear from Bob Blakely, if you would tell us a little bit about yourself and why this topic is key for you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Joni. So I'm Bob Blakely. I am the Director of Information Security Innovation at Citibank. And before joining the bank, I've worked for many years in information security and privacy, including on a number of technical standards in the industry, and also worked in the academic community on security and privacy problems. I think the thing that most strikes me about the point that we are at right now is that we're getting ready to cross over from a territory in which we were able to program and understand individual computer systems, even if they were, sort of made of collections of smaller computers. They sort of functioned as discrete devices, into an environment which is almost ecological in the sense that there will be very large numbers of computerized algorithmic systems embedded in all kinds of different pieces of technology with very complex behaviors and interactions with the physical world. And the large majority of today's programmers and engineers haven't been trained in how systems of that type work. So we're used to programming, imperative programming language, programming, but we're not really used to working with complex adaptive systems. When I was at the University of Michigan as a graduate student, I sat in the same hall as John Holland, who passed away recently, and as a number of other of the founders of the study of complex adaptive systems, guys like Chris Langton and Doug Hofstadter and others. And it was a real eye-opener to observe how quickly really complicated and counterintuitive behaviors could arise from collections of very, very simple devices. So I think it's both exciting in the sense that there's lots of stuff that we've never been able to do before that we'll be able to do with collections of these things, and also daunting in the sense that there is an entirely new engineering discipline that we're going to have to learn to get it right.
Thanks so much, Bob.
Thanks so much, Bob.
Moving along. So let's hear next, please, from Robin Wilton. Robin, will you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your focus in this particular topic?
Hi, Joni. Thanks for that. Yes, I'm Robin Wilton. I am in the Trust and Identity team of the Internet Society, which is my first foray into the non-profit sector after 28 years or so in the IT industry. And during those 28 years, I've mostly focused on security, banking systems, identity, and lately privacy and public policy. I'm also a trustee of the Kantara Initiative, working on federated identity and secure attribute exchange. And I think my interest in this comes very much from the privacy angle to start with. But I think it goes a little bit beyond that. And to pick up some of the themes that Bob raised, I think the pervasiveness of computers in our lives these days means that they exercise an effect not just on our privacy, but on many other aspects of our lives, the extent to which we're able to exercise autonomy, the extent to which we're able to access our rights, and so on. So their impact, I think, really is potentially very broad indeed. And as Bob said, we're already in a state where research into artificial intelligence finds that autonomous or artificially intelligent systems regularly exhibit unexpected or unpredicted behavior. And that's just individual artificial intelligences. When they start to interact, as Bob said, it can very quickly get chaotic, exhibit chaotic characteristics. So I think the design disciplines that Bob referred to, if you state them at their simplest, they boil down to three things. You can either have a system that only does what it's did, so it's fully deterministic, or you can have one that does that and is secure. In other words, it can't be subverted by someone else as opposed to itself. And then you can have a system that can decide and implement its own parameters. And that's clearly where we are. But under those circumstances, what happens to things like ethics? If I use a system but I don't control its behavior, then who is responsible for what that system does? And I think we'll probably come on to talk about some specific examples later, like self-driving cars. I think those are just one example. As Bob said, there are embedded systems, there are small devices. As you said, Joni, there are personal quantifiable self devices that are generating data in increasing volumes. And all of those things, to my mind, reflect potentially a loss of what I call user agency. In other words, the user's ability to control and therefore to be responsible for what those devices do on their behalf. Now, in simple terms, we see that already, because you interact with the internet through things like a browser or a mobile device, but those systems and devices do things that you didn't tell them to do, and yet they are the way in which you interact with the system. So you're forfeiting some of your agency, some of your ability to control what happens. And I think that's a fascinating ethical and moral area that algorithms and algorithmic access control and autonomous systems lead us to very, very quickly.
So thanks so much, Robin. The comments so far kind of already remind me of this TED Talk, which I was watching, that basically was about making hard decisions. And it came down to the conclusion, the woman giving the talk, that hard decisions are hard because they're hard, and there often isn't a good answer. So the way that hard decisions often get made really depends on the self and where your culture, context, and comfort zone are. So it just kind of struck me as interesting when you're thinking about applying mathematics to decision making, and how kind of key that self and what works for the self is to making those kinds of hard decisions in general. But I digress. Thank you, Robin. So let's move on, and I'd like to hear a little bit from Steve Wilson. And please tell us a little bit about yourself and your particular interest for algorithmic access control.
Sure, thanks, Joni, and really good to be on the team today. My background, my training is in physics, electrical engineering, and computer science. The early part of my career was in some really hard computer science. I was part of the team that wrote the first software for implantable defibrillators about 25 years ago. So we learned, and we were really deeply immersed in software quality, software verification, and the limits of algorithms. We even did things like we wrote our own compiler, we did assembly code inspections of the defibrillator software before it was released. So we lived and breathed software quality. I also remember being trained in structured programming, and we did some maths in computer science back in the 70s and 80s, where we learned about the limits of algorithms. And all of this learning, I think, is coming back now. My career now is very much in identity, privacy, and security. And I observed that we just ain't seen nothing yet. We're plunging into the Internet of Things. We are on the verge of having these self-driving cars. We're talking with a straight face about programmable ethics. And we'll talk about this in some more detail, but I want to bring a little bit of mathematical rigor to the problem. There are some very simple problems that can't be solved by computers, and with a straight face we think that we can get computers and cars to solve these autonomous ethics problems. So I think that there's a lot of hubris in computing, and we are about to face some really interesting multidiscipline problems. I like the way that Bob's talked about ecology, but you know, there's going to be some pure maths and there's going to be some philosophy that we need to go back to tackle these problems. It's fascinating.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think it is fascinating as well, and you know, when I start to think about algorithmic access control, and you know, recognizing it is not a new field, and there have been many experts who have done great work in the field. So so this is not a to this panel only, but of course you start to think about Internet of Things, and in that, when I think about Internet of Things, I often think about risks and opportunities, and it's more often than not you have both of those kind of sides of the equation. And so what I'd like to ask is if you would each focus a little bit on kind of one opportunity, and then perhaps the mitigating, some of the risk factors and mitigating approaches. And you know, we can think about things like, you know, I heard a few times unpredictability was mentioned. So could I ask you each to elaborate a little bit with kind of some specific opportunities, and then perhaps some of the mitigating actions from a risk perspective with regard to algorithmic access control. And maybe we'll go backwards order this time, and we'll stay here with you, Steve, and work our way back through. Thank you.
What's the algorithm for unmuting? There we go. Gosh, I mean, opportunities. I don't know where to start with opportunities. I think it's clear that the promise of things like self-driving cars. You know, I think that self-driving cars are probably the pointy end of all of this, and it's where so much of our thinking sort of gets sharpened. The opportunities are clearly enormous. I am convinced by the statistics that show that a phenomenal amount of morbidity and mortality results from human failings. And so if we had a future world where all of the cars are self-driving and all of the lorries are self-driving, and we're using algorithms and machine learning and machine vision, then I think there's a case to be made that society will benefit. I think that what we're not dealing with is that we're not dealing with computed frailty. Now let's just go back to the maths of some of this for a minute. This is really important. And first year computer scientists used to get taught this. I don't know whether it's part of the curriculum anymore, but an algorithm is a repeatable set of instructions. It's classically something that's run on a computer. It could be a recipe. It has a fixed set of instructions. It operates on a fixed set of inputs, and an algorithm has a fixed set of responses to what's going on. And if all of the inputs are the same, and if all of the conditions and history of the algorithm and the computer are the same, then the thing becomes deterministic. The problem with algorithms is twofold. One of them is fundamental. Mathematicians have known for a really long time that some very simple problems just don't have an algorithmic solution, which is to say that you can't program a computer to solve some problems. There's the famous halting problem in computer science. It has no algorithmic solution. There's the traveling salesperson problem. You know, how do you plot the most efficient course across a number of interconnected towns? There is no efficient algorithmic solution to that problem. Now we fast forward to the idea that we can program cars to drive themselves reliably. We can program cars to drive themselves ethically. And I just think that if there are problems like the halting problem that can't be solved by a computer, it's incredible hubris to think that we're going to put cars out on the road that can solve things like the trolley problem, right? How do you get a car to make an autonomous decision about two ethically conflicted courses of action? Are you going to mow down a bunch of children, or are you going to sacrifice the driver of the car? We can do a whole lot of coffee table and theoretical analyses and what-if scenarios. Just as a sidebar, I wonder whether or not Google and some of these other companies are putting their cars out on test tracks and actually testing things like the trolley problem. That'd be fantastic. The practical problem in all of this too is simply complexity. Bob made the point that until recently we could predict and be comfortable with the behavior of computers. In the case of real-time computing, even that capability we lost many years ago. Non-trivial real-time problems are untestable. There are so many combinations of inputs and possible responses that you can never test these things thoroughly. So when we used to develop implantable defibrillator software, we would do exhaustive code inspections. We actually spent 2 months once walking through line by line 40,000 lines of C of this defibrillator before we shipped it. Now 40,000 lines of software is unheard of these days. You know, I hate to think how much software is in a Google car. It's probably 40 million lines of software. We have to confront these problems. We have to work out untestable real-time software needs to be verified in other ways. And finally, all of this adds up, both theoretically because of the halting problem and practically because of the enormous combinatorial complexity. We have to face the fact that the failure modes of these systems is going to be unpredictable. And I think that for society, that's a really weird thing. I don't want to get caught up in liability and law and courts and stuff, because that's kind of ugly and unconstructive. But the reality is that we are used to attributing blame when things go wrong. And that's not just about getting money back, but it's about being comfortable with what went wrong and how we're going to stop it from going wrong again in the future. If you look at what's happening with stock markets already, you know, Black Monday has already been blamed to some degree on algorithmic trading, but it's quite clear that some of the stock market behaviors are now becoming unpredictable because of the algorithms and the complexity. We need to deal with this. It's going to be quite shocking, I think, that when a car crash happens and it was not predictable in advance, and it's going to be difficult to unwind what happened. We need to ask ourselves whether we're ready to cope with, you know, what I call computed frailty. Human frailty is something that's difficult, but we know how to deal with it. Computed frailty is going to be quite another thing.
Yeah, and I guess the time, I guess the term that I think about when you talk about blame would be, you know, accountability, and how do we measure or provide that accountability that is so key. So actually, Bob, I would like to hear maybe a little bit more on this topic and this thread running from you, please. Thanks.
Sure. So to begin with, I think it's important to note that stock markets have always been unpredictable in this way. So stock markets are, by definition, complex adaptive systems, and the individual actors in stock markets are computationally a lot more complex than computer programs because they're humans. The thing I think that people worry about with automation in that environment is not that markets will be unpredictable, it's that they will be unpredictable on a time scale which is faster than humans can react to in a useful way. And I think maybe that's a good jumping off point for a couple of things that I could say about opportunities and risks. So I guess if I if I get to ask Santa Claus this year for a present for complex adaptive systems and the Internet of Things, what I'm going to ask for is that we as a society have the good sense to apply algorithmics to problems where they are appropriately applied, and to apply humans to problems where they're appropriately applied. And I think there are a couple of ways that we can think about this, right? So we have a pretty good, at this point, grip on human cognitive limitations. So we know lots of situations where human decision-making frequently arrives at a suboptimal outcome. And those kinds of situations are good situations for application of algorithmic decision-making, because we can do a lot of testing and make sure that the algorithms aren't as dumb as we are in these situations. And I think maybe the other thing that we ought to think about is hazardous environments. So I was struck the other day when I had my trees trimmed at my house you know, what insanity it is for a bunch of human beings to climb up into the tops of tall trees with chainsaws. You know, an autonomous, like, you know, the tree trimming Roomba would be probably a lot safer, and also maybe even more entertaining than human tree trimmers. Although, you know, anybody who's parked their car under a tree and had birds do what they do probably doesn't prefer chainsaws falling out of trees. But so I think before we move straight to trying to solve the most complicated, unconstrained problems we can solve, we can probably do ourselves a lot of good by thinking about constrained environments in which either we don't want to put humans or humans perform poorly, and seeing whether, given the set of constraints, we can design sensible algorithmics. And in a certain sense, I would think of this as almost an ethics-first approach, right? Instead of designing a really complicated and potentially dangerous system and then thinking about its ethical implications, how about if we think about the ethics first and decide, well, you know, actually, I don't really want to have a human do that. Let's see if we can find something that's more expendable to do that job, and then apply our engineering talent to that kind of problem.
So this is kind of ethics by design, almost, is what it sounds like a bit to me. I love the fact that you have brought even a step further back, which is try to identify the right tool for the right solution, and couple those first rather than try to solve everything. And also, you know, just to summarize, I also heard, and I think this is great, you know, this saying of how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time. So, you know, we're thinking about things like pilots and not kind of jumping head first into this into that space, and kind of piloting how to make the appropriate. It almost makes me think about how do you make the appropriate decision for ethics for a human versus an algorithm, and I'm sure that there's lots of school of thought happening in that space already. Thanks so much, Bob. I wanted to hear a little bit from Robin, if you would, you know, either following from Bob's thread or some more of your own regarding opportunities and risks, and maybe even around that unpredictability and your thoughts. Thanks, Robin.
Sure, thanks, Jenny. Well, let's start with some of the risks first, and to pick up on things that both Bob and Steve have mentioned so far. Self-driving cars, I mean, they're a great kind of petri dish for looking at what grows in this environment. And several of us were at the Cloud Identity Summit, and one of the most perceptive comments I heard at that conference was about self-driving cars, and it was from not one of the highly qualified expert speakers, but from one of the audiovisual staff. So Tara McKinney gets a real shout out here, because she said one of the most interesting things I heard at the conference. What she said was, what's the basis on which self-driving cars are going to make these collision decisions? So as Steve said, you know, it'd be interesting to actually face an autonomous vehicle with the trolley problem and see what it does. But you can quite see how the kinds of factor that get programmed into a decision-making algorithm of that kind could take us into some very dodgy areas. So, for instance, not just, you know, am I going to kill the person who's not driving the car, or am I going to injure 3 pedestrians on the sidewalk? But what about, am I going to crash into the less insured or the more insured vehicle? Am I going to damage the person who has the highest net worth, or go for someone who has a lower net worth? You can see how in time feeds of all that kind of data will be accessible and could actually form input to some of these decisions. And even before we get to that stage, you can also see how more worrying social factors might be taken into account, like, for example, ethnicity. There are some very dodgy ethical grounds that we could go down in a reasonably predictable timescale, foreseeable timescale. Now, Steve said maybe we just need to go back to the ethical principles here, and Bob mentioned, you know, designing for ethics. That's something I did some research in over the last year or so, and it's really not simple. Even if you go back to fairly basic ethical models, of which there are generally seen to be about 3, you end up with a utilitarian model where you base the goodness or badness of an action on its outcome. But in designing some of these systems, we've already looked at how unpredictable they can be, and it may not actually be foreseeable what the outcome would be. You get rules-based systems, which is pretty much where we are now with privacy. There's a set of rules that say what you should do with personal data, but actually that's not working terribly well. It's not well implemented and it's not well enforced. And ultimately, you can question whether the ethical outcomes of personal data handling are actually currently working well on that model. And then there's an ethical model based on ideas of justice or fairness. And there you run into the problem that I raised at the outset about autonomy and user agency. If the user hands over control to an algorithm or an intelligent or autonomous device, then who's deciding what outcomes are fair? Is it the device? Is it the programmer of the device? Is it some combination of those? It's almost certainly not the person who is controlling or sitting in the device, or sitting under the device if it's Bob's chainsaw wielding Roomba. So to what extent are we expecting systems to decide what is fair? And as Steve said, these are decisions that human beings can't make. To suddenly assume that we're going to program devices to make them, I think, is, as he said, hubristic. Well, that all paints a pretty bleak picture. So what's the flip side? I think there is an opportunity here. We currently carry around more computing power, or wear more computing power, than was conceivable 40 years ago, and than you could fit into a room 40 years ago, let's face it. I think there is a huge opportunity to put more of that processing power to use, putting users' preferences into effect. So we've got very intelligent browsers with amazing plugins that do fantastic things on our behalf, but they could do much more to reflect what we want and what our preferences are. So I would like to see adaptive systems that learn about my privacy preferences and that put those preferences into effect without me necessarily having to go and flick switches and tune dials and press buttons all the time. I'd like to see adaptive systems learning what my preferences are and putting those into effect.
Yeah, thanks so much, Robin. I think it just kind of comes back to that. Hard decisions are just that. They are hard decisions, and there's not always a correct answer. And, we do have the, as always, the opportunities and the risks. And I think communities like IEEE, like all of you who are on the panel, and so many, there are many voices that will contribute to help solve these issues and help to evolve them over time. But if we stick for a little bit on ethics, and if we stick on algorithmic access control and start to think a little bit about governance and start to think, Robin, you also mentioned, perhaps different ethnicities or maybe even gender, sexual orientation, things of that nature. Personal practices that would have never crossed over into our professional or other areas of our lives before. I would like to hear a little bit from Anna. Anna, and I'm not sure if we have your video, but that's okay because your audio is the key thing here, so we get to hear your thoughts. I would like to hear your thoughts about governance and some, perhaps, your thoughts on high-level strategies for governance for algorithmic access control, particularly any kind of risks or mitigations around discriminatory practices that might arise or have the potential to arise out of the systems. And Anna, you may still be on mute. Thank you. I hear you now.
Thank you. Actually, it's interesting because the issues that I've been thinking about the most are less issues about programming autonomous systems and more the effect on the person who's affected by these systems. Not so much by the self-driving cars as by algorithms that select which job applications will be presented to a human recruiter. about the way content is sorted and presented, about the way health risks are being determined through the analysis of consumer data, everything from shopping preferences to from shopping behavior to social media data. All of this digital exhaust that's out there is being munged, and people are being classified in ways that is not obvious to them. So we have a bit of a disconnect between behavior and the consequences of that behavior. So the kinds of questions that I worry about is whether or not algorithms actually lead to discrimination, or in fact perpetuate discrimination, because the current training data on which algorithms used to train on potentially could have our human discrimination built into it because they have our history built into it. I worry about due process. So what happens if you in fact figure out that you have been a subject of decisions that are not appropriate, you think, or that are discriminatory, or that you think are otherwise harmful? Do you even know who made those decisions? Do you know, is there any kind of process to remedy the situation? I worry about the growth of data collection because we have this great and growing desire for precision. Precision hiring, precision advertising, precision matching between the worker and the task. And in order to do that, and in particular in order to do that in non-discriminatory ways, we may need to collect a lot more data and a lot more sensitive data. So, you know, Joni asked about governance, and I think the first step in governance is even knowing what's happening. I think many algorithms in use today are not only non-transparent in terms of what the software says, but even the fact that the software and the algorithms are being used. And I think unless we find a way to make that more transparent, I think the other governance conversations will be much more difficult to have.
So thank you, Anna. You know, and it reminds me of just a personal story. I was moving from one jurisdiction to another, and an officer between those jurisdictions decided to look up my Twitter and started asking me about, well, it says your location is here, and it says this, and it says that, and I said, well, you know, those assertions have no authority in any way, so they don't just, you could say I'm in China when I'm obviously in a different place. And the person who was asking said, oh yeah, that's right. So, you know, having a way to, sometimes this information can be asserted and may have no grounds in kind of reality or accuracy because something is asserted. So I'd like to ask, I'd like to move to, we actually have a question from Twitter from John C. Havens. And what he's asking is, has anyone on the panel have given thought, or would they like to share thoughts on Google's DeepMind's non-public ethics board and Lucid's AI ethics panel? So that's a live question, and has there anyone that's given any thought to those the instance of those panels and the non-publicness or perhaps non-transparency of them? Thanks for that question. Anyone want to take that? Okay, Bob. Okay, Bob.
Yeah, so I actually don't know very much about the specific panels that are being talked about, but I guess there are a couple of things to say. The first is there may be reasons for ethics deliberations to be non-public because the deliberations themselves sometimes involve information whose disclosure could be sensitive or privacy invasive. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that the deliberations of the panel are not public. What I would like to see, and I don't know whether this is the case or not in this particular instance, as I said, I haven't looked into these specifically. I would like to see a public statement of the ethical principles on the basis of which decisions are made by the panel. And I think a discussion surrounding both the principles and you know, sort of the decision-making process is probably likely to be productive in terms of improving the performance of that sort of thing.
So, does anybody else want to comment before we move on?
Just that I would add that we need to be a bit cautious on drawing too many parallels between these ethics processes, so-called, and previous things. I mean, things like IRBs for clinical trials. As Bob says, there's a lot of commercial sensitivity and personal privacy and confidentiality, so that's fine. But you know, the scope of a clinical trial is normally small groups of people, relatively small, and very tight consent. For example, everybody knows what they're getting into when they sign up to a clinical trial, and they get advice on what it means and what commitments they're making. But when some of these companies take self-driving cars, for example, out onto public motorways as part of their testing, I think that, you know, the ethics and the control and the experiments that they're running all of a sudden have tentacles and touch points into the public at large. That probably, in my view, I'm not an ethicist, but my gut feel is that the exposure and the transparency and the sunlight that's required in these ethics processes probably deserves more transparency than what normally happens in drug trials and medical research, for example.
So thanks, Steve, and you know, I can certainly see reasons for keeping deliberations non-public when you to protect people's privacy as well, to protect privacy until, you know, all facts are in and so on and so forth. So you know, kind of both sides of that story are appreciated. Robin, I wonder, do you have any comments that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm going to make a wild extrapolation from the way that I see things working at the moment, particularly in the privacy sphere. And I'm going to predict that when an ethics review board goes to the designers and manufacturers of an autonomous system and says, look, we've done the ethical review, we've identified these problems, we think that these behaviors of this, potential behaviors of this system are really problematic. That someone from legal will say, that's awfully kind of you, thanks for pointing that out. We'll go away and draft a couple more disclaimers to put into the terms and conditions for this product, just to make sure that no liability comes back to us. And I think that there's a risk that under those circumstances we will see exactly the same kind of behavior as we currently see, that actually the ethical outcomes are dealt with not by improving the behavior of the system, but by strengthening the disclaimers that cover the service provider's backside.
Thanks so much for those comments to our live question there on Twitter, and just a reminder in my lower third, hash IEEE net policy if you want to send in questions or thoughts. So I wanted to move a little bit to something that is, I think, quite becoming more and more common in the identity management space, and may or may not be something that, you know, people outside of the identity management field of study are thinking about, but if we think about algorithmic decision making and a kind of inherent dependency on maybe a certain level of accuracy or validity to the data that it's collecting in order to make decisions when those decisions when that would be appropriate, I wonder if we could hear from the panelists a little bit about kind of context, and a little bit about maybe just at the ground level when it comes to people, and we are focusing on people today. We realize the scope can be much bigger for algorithmic decision making. When it comes to people, can we hear a little bit about from the panelists' thoughts about control, labeling, consent? And I think, Robin, you kind of started with that. So I'd like to hear a little bit from Robin and then from Bob around control, labeling, context, and how these come together for metadata to kind of inform, could possibly inform decision making. Robin and then Bob, thanks.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Okay, so does this mean I get to plug our South by Southwest proposal for how consent is broken?
Well, you can mention it.
I shan't plug that because that would be totally unethical, but please vote, guys. Yeah, consent is a huge issue. And you mentioned context as well. So let's see what we can weave out of those two. I think the way that consent is handled currently really doesn't tend to work, at least in the favor of the end user. Too often we see things like the consent approach embodied in current cookie notices, which basically say, agree to us setting cookies and doing what we like with the resulting data, or go away. And by the way, it's not clear to me what happens if you do go away, whether the fact that you visited is recorded despite your tacit indication that you don't want to visit under those terms. So I just don't think that works. When it comes to context, I think this is a really key concept, because the idea of context is absolutely fundamental to the way that we understand as humans, the way we understand things like privacy, trust, ethical decisions. To give a really simple example, I'm sure that everyone as a kid in the playground told a secret to their best friend and then found that that friend told someone else. And I think that's the first time that as a human being, you learn what context really means. And particularly, you learn what it means when a context is violated. Now, that happens to us all the time online in privacy terms, because the context in which you disclose data, knowingly or otherwise, is very seldom the context in which that data ends up getting used. So an understanding of context, as I say, is foundational to our understanding of how trust works, how privacy works, how personal interactions work. So how does that relate to this topic of autonomous systems? Well, because we are making autonomous systems proxies for our own interactions with other people. And as we do that, and as those proxies interact with other people and other systems, they do so on our behalf. So our understanding of how our context transfers or doesn't transfer to that other agent on our behalf is, I think, a really key one. It's got ethical dimensions, it's got practical dimensions, it's got contractual ones, and it's got design implications that strike at the heart of this. And that reflects the question that John asked on Twitter, that really this is about how you take into account those factors when you're designing these systems and putting them into practice.
Thanks. Bob, any comments to add there?
Sure. So I think there's a temptation when we are talking about issues of privacy and consent to try to solve problems using more rules and more secrecy. And I think, Robin correctly noted that hasn't been very effective, right? So the idea that consent exists for the purpose of enforcing secrecy rules hasn't played out as effectively as maybe we thought it would a decade or two ago. So maybe, a piece of work that Robin and I and Ian Glaser and others did when all of us were back at Burton Group and subsequently Gartner tried to turn that equation on its head. The paper that resulted from this, Ian wrote it, it was called Relationship Context Metadata. But basically the idea was that we might be better off if personal data always came with a chain of custody that demonstrated where it had originated and whose hands it had passed through, and also maybe what people said they were going to do with it, right? So if somebody collected my address in order to ship me a box of of Christmas cards, and then later used it for some other purpose, even if there isn't a rule in place, if that chain of custody information, which maybe we from a privacy point of view instinctively think should be kept secret, instead maybe if that were widely available, the patterns of information flow through the global information ecosystem would become more clear, and people might start saying, well, gosh, there's an entity over there which I've never really talked to, which seems, to be getting every piece of my personal information. Why is that? And, and is that really in my interest? So I think, it's hard. I guess Alan Dershowitz wrote this great book, Rights from Wrongs, and it was about civil rights and human rights, but it can be applied, I think, equally to rights in the technology ecosystem. And the idea was that the way that the legal system adapts to better protect people's rights is that it observes bad things happening and it creates rules to prevent repetitions of that. And so to the extent that you think bad things are happening with your data, today you sort of have to be a conspiracy theorist, because all the bad things that are happening with your data are happening behind closed doors. So maybe the first thing to concentrate on is not what policies we want, and it's not what penalties we want. It's simply in turning the lights on so that we can actually see what is happening to data and have a rational conversation about that and make decisions about it.
Yeah, and you reminded me there, Bob. One would be this, I've heard this idea of encapsulating as it moves on and kind of tagging who received it and what was going to happen next. And I hate to bring up the B word, but it almost sounds a little blockchainy, possibly to me. But so we may see some interesting solutions come out. Yeah, I know. That way forward is very interesting. But the other thing that you reminded me of, Bob, is this tendency to layer on a policy after a bad thing happens, and it kind of reminds me of a little bit of right to be forgotten. No judgments of is this right or wrong in terms of policy making, but rather it's policy making that happened after people outcried about things happening. And then there's the other side of that and I think where people like you and organizations like IEEE and so many others can actually bring the lights on to the technologies, what happens, so we can understand kind of, well, actually this technology was built to do that, so that's why X happened. So that can really help inform policymakers to be much more proactive in what they do. Well, I wanted to get some thoughts from Anna. Anna, thoughts about this context and relationship context and how it plays into algorithmic access control.
Thanks, Joni. It's actually this notion of making the chain of custody public is an interesting notion. I think Facebook tried that when they tried to publicize people's activity on other sites and thereby disclosed any number of Christmas presents and other kinds of things that folks were hoping to keep confidential. And that's actually the big issue with a lot of data being collected and used out of context. We lose the ability to tell what the link is between our actions and the things people know about us and the consequences of our actions. So, if somebody starts looking at data out of context, they can potentially infer information about people that they want to keep secret. Remember the big to-do about Target identifying a pregnant teen before she had made that information public. And by the way, Target is by far not the only one that's doing that kind of thing. There have been numerous reports of healthcare companies, insurance companies, and healthcare providers trying to use essentially the same data that's used by marketers to try to infer health risks. Well, if that's the case, we lose the ability to tell what our actions actually say about us, who sees them, and what conclusions they draw. I don't know that we know how to live with that yet. I don't know that we have actually understood how to adjust our behavior or our thinking, knowing that anything we say and do can be used completely out of context and in a way that could either benefit us or hurt us, and we just don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Anna. You remind me of something that feels as old as the hills now that I had seen way back when I used to do some work for an organization, Voice XML, and also in the identity space, which was the pizza video where someone calls to order a pizza, and because all of this metadata has been collected, the woman says, "Oh, well, you seem to be a little bit overweight. I don't think you should get pepperoni this time around." And these concerns and ideas this is going back almost 15 years. So I mean, this is, I think, something that we've seen coming, and there's been a lot of work in the space, and the question of are we prepared is one that is perhaps very much open. Open for debate. So, Steve, it's been such a great discussion. I wonder if you have any further thoughts about the information handling and context with regard to algorithmic access control.
Thanks, Jody. I just wanted to respond or riff on this idea that we are always adding to policies. We have some sort of bad experience and we write a new policy. And it reminds me of this dilemma that algorithms bring to the front and center. Especially we in security, we've been railing against checkbox security forever, right? We're very frustrated by robotic management. We're very frustrated by auditors that are rigid in their thinking. But now we're talking about non-rules-based artificial intelligence, and we're right on the leading edge. The stuff of neural networks is still in the lab and not ready for commercial application yet. So, a practical access control problem, for example, look at those complicated, very context-dependent scenarios in first responders, for example. You've got very complicated scenarios where first responders from a particular territory are going to come to an emergency in another place. They're coming in with credentials that can't be easily read. The attributes from one particular fire department in France are not machine readable by a fire department in California. People on the ground faced with these life and death decisions are going to make access control decisions. They're going to grant access to resources. They're going to let people get the job done because it's the right thing to do. Now, in risk-based security, we're familiar with the idea of an exception not being in the rule book. Empowering people on the ground to make a decision, do the right thing, manage a particular risk, and then write things down. I mean, when I've been a security manager, I'm always telling people exceptions are the stuff of life. Make a call, manage, and then write down the exceptions. Now, that's sort of fairly advanced security thinking, right? We're trying to get away from checkbox thinking and rigid rules, but it defeats me, to be honest, about how we're going to program computers to do this. This is really quite new. Yeah, so it's a dilemma, isn't it? We want to get computers to take over human decision making, and yet we are constantly frustrated by humans who behave too much like computers.
So yeah, it is a bit befuddling and complex, and something is still sticking with me from earlier in the discussion, and it's just around this issue of complexity and layering complex systems together. So I would like to take a few minutes to think about this idea of this kind of anomalies in the system or unpredictable results from algorithms that are meant to be predictable. And as we start to kind of stack those systems together more and more, that to me was a really interesting and specific complex scenario. So I wonder if the panelists have experience with multiple algorithmic environments working together, because as much as we talk about developing the right policy and strategies for that and turning the lights on or having the lights off, it seems that these systems are moving forward in any case, and so we do have the existence. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what happens when these systems interplay together, what complexities are introduced by multiple algorithmic systems working together, and is there are there kind of speed limits we can put on this, or is there a way that we can, noting that this technology is moving forward, can we keep the genie can we get the genie in the bottle, so to speak? I wonder if Bob would share a little bit about these complex systems at play, and thoughts there.
Sure. So first of all, I think it's important to talk about diversity in these systems, right? So I mean, diversity, complexity, and context are really the three things that I would go to first in trying to analyze these sorts of problems. So my sense is that if you have an ecosystem which consists, let's say, a road network, for example, that consists of nothing but paved roads which have been designed with the needs of the sensor systems of autonomous vehicles on them, and it consists of a population of homogeneous Google self-driving cars with the same software version, that is probably safer than a system of the same type which has both Google and Apple self-driving cars, and that is almost certainly safer than a system which has Google self-driving cars, Apple self-driving cars, and human-driven cars. And then additionally, if you relax the constraint, right, so that a whole bunch of folks, so that the Google self-driving off-road four-wheeler and the human off-road four-wheeler, can go tearing it up in the backwoods, that's probably the least safe environment of all. And actually, one of the reasons that an all-autonomous homogeneous system is probably safer than others is because if you have a system like that, you can actually sort of define the context constraints in the system, and whenever a context constraint is violated, you can have the system switch into a safe mode where everybody, slows down, and the system has to stop and restart rather than doing something dangerous. If you have a system that has the autonomous entities and the humans running around in it at the same time, if all of a sudden all of the autonomous vehicles stop, then a human who has gotten used to autonomous vehicles not stopping suddenly will run into the back of them, and it will be unsafe. So there probably are different design disciplines for all autonomous environments versus mixed autonomous human environments. And I guess another thing that it really pays to pay attention to is the extent to which algorithmic systems are autonomous versus advisory, right? So there's probably a lot of safety and functionality benefit to be gained from algorithmic systems which tell a human, who's driving on a foggy highway in New Jersey, traffic has stopped 100 yards ahead, why don't you slow down? And that might in some ways be almost as useful as a system which went ahead and slowed down all by itself, but it might both increase the alertness of the human for the inevitable times when the system has to say, oh my God, I don't know what to do, I'll just hand control back to you. And it also might give us more graceful global system degradation in the face of contexts which are unanticipated or too complicated for the algorithmic system to understand. I guess for the moment I'll leave it at that and let my colleagues comment.
Great. So, Robin, I wonder, do you have anything to add on this topic? I think we're talking about the whole kind of mixed, heterogeneous, homogeneous, autonomous versus advisory. So, Robin, any thoughts to add here?
Sure, just something fairly brief to pick up on Bob's comments there. And I suppose in one way I was quite encouraged at the recent IETF sessions in Prague to hear that the people working on vehicle systems were very much focusing on advisory, so driver warnings, driver messages, driver alerts, and so on, as a first step. And I found that reassuring in the sense that they weren't trying to leap straight to full autonomy of the vehicle. But I suspect this will make Bob either laugh or cry. Obviously, if you're going to do advisory messages in that environment, you want them to arrive securely. And so here's a really good asymmetric way of securing that kind of traffic, and it's based on a PKI. But let's not do it the way people have done up to now. Let's have a different set of PKI standards, a different certificate format, a different... Every aspect of the PKI that was being proposed in this deployment was going to be not what has been standardized over the past decade or two. Yeah, it remains to be seen whether that's going to be a good idea or not. I'm not claiming that all the PKI standards that have been formulated over the past couple of decades have been fantastic, but I would question the wisdom of changing them at the same time as you try to do a large-scale, real-time driver advisory system in that, as Bob said, heterogeneous environment. So yeah, I don't know whether to be depressed about that or or optimistic in the fun. At least they were taking small steps. Baby steps are a good start, but as someone from Google once pointed out, baby steps can also go over the edge of a cliff.
So optimistic, pessimistic, we can be neutral today and call it at that. And thanks, Robin. Anna, with your research, I wonder if you have anything to add from the perspective of... Great, thank you.
Well, I find the notion of advisory autonomous systems very interesting because, in fact, we are trying to make more and more of those. My research for the past year and a half has been focused on healthcare. And of course, as we have moved more to electronic health records, we have tried increasingly to include alerts and various other kinds of advisory notices to physicians about drug interactions, drug food interactions, about potential problems that are going on. And what's very interesting about that is that making those advisory systems is actually very complicated because you not only have to have the right algorithm to provide the right advisory, but you also have to account for the human ability to absorb the number of alerts and make decisions as the advisories come in. So I recently read a book, I forget the author of it, but one of the things he was discussing is the difference between electronic health records and alerts and the alerts in aircraft cockpits. It's actually very, very difficult to get a new alert into an aircraft cockpit because there's been a lot of time spent on thinking about what will be a distraction and what is actually a necessary alert for the pilot. We aren't at that point yet with electronic health records, and so you end up with alert fatigue, you end up with physicians doing what in retrospect looks like really stupid things because they received so many alerts or the alerts that they couldn't react to and they ignored the ones that they should have reacted to. So it's an interesting area, but it has its own complexities that are absent from building purely autonomous systems.
Yeah, this is this idea of click training. You know, this is so hard for consent and user interaction. Often, you know, it's clicking to get the cookie or the thing that you want at the other end. You know, consent and alerts are really, really hard, and designing from a user-centric perspective can be quite complex. Steve, anything to add with regard to advisory?
Well, just to pick up on Anna's point about designing systems for alerts, there's that famous case of the Qantas A380 that blew up an engine on the way into Singapore a couple of years ago. There have been books written about it, it's fantastic. But one of the things that I noticed was the Qantas engineers at base who are monitoring these planes in real time, and they're receiving telemetry all the time. on their screen, all of a sudden, when the engine blew up and it went through all of the flight control systems, the shrapnel destroyed everything, they got something like 150 alerts on a screen at once. The pilot says that in the very worst case scenarios that they ever train for in simulators, they get 5 simultaneous alerts and they have to work it through. They had 150 alerts at once. There were so many alerts that the people at Qantas Base saw the machine, saw the screens going crazy. They thought that the actual alert system had broken down, and they dismissed it for several minutes. They said, "This, we're getting noise." So it's just an interesting point about how do you design these alert systems for human readers.
Wow, I did not know that story, and I could not imagine getting 150 alerts at a time. That would be so stressful. That's really unbelievable. So, as we can see, algorithmic decision making and access control is not just about the algorithm, but all of the things in the data that goes into having the ability for these algorithms to make control, including the context to know when to use an algorithm or not, when that's appropriate, is part of where we started today. So I'd like to, this has been a great discussion, and there's one thing that I always try to do when we have these types of discussions, and I like to ask the panelists to think about if there is kind of one actionable comment that you can leave them with today, and that can be anything from your personal perspective. Is there one actionable thought, area of focus that you'd like to leave the viewers today? And let me mention this is being recorded, so people can watch it at any time. One actionable thought for the viewers and listeners when they finish watching this session. Maybe we can start with Anna on this. What's your actionable thought from our discussion today?
Well, it has been a very interesting conversation, and several people mentioned various types and degrees of transparency. When I think about one thing that I would like people to ask is, before you deploy an algorithm, ask yourself what would happen if the people who are the subject of these decisions found out what you're doing and the inferences you're making. Would you ask them for that information? And see how you feel about the answer. If the answer is yes, you're probably okay to go forward. If you start questioning whether or not people would be willing to give you the data that you would derive from the inferences, I think you have some more work to do before deployment.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I think that's really, really helpful. Let's run through the line. So Bob, kind of wrap up an actionable thought, with regard to all the topics we covered today around algorithmic access control.
So I guess I'm going to be the boring corporate guy who makes the predictable recommendation. So working with autonomous or algorithmic systems is really a new discipline. So you can't really go out and hire yourself a chief algorithmics officer and have him put together or her put together a team and have everything be okay. So I think what I would recommend is that if your organization is thinking about developing or already developing algorithmic systems that do things that that are really going to affect people's lives, and you should think very carefully about that, because I think almost all of them will affect people's lives. What you really need to do before anything else is put together a team of people with the right set of perspectives to ask the right questions, and that's going to include predictably security people, privacy people, and legal people. Pardon me, my phone is doing something stupid here. But it's also going to involve product designers. It's going to involve corporate communications staff. It's going to include safety engineers. There's a large body of research done by people who design things like industrial control systems and aeronautics and other complicated and potentially dangerous artifacts that is really relevant to this design space. And you need to have people asking, what is the worst case scenario for this algorithmic system, right? So if Chainsaw Roomba, goes on the market, and somebody sends a small population of Chainsaw Roombas up a tree, in a daycare playground, and a windstorm comes up, and all of a sudden it's raining Chainsaw Roombas on school children, that's going to be a bad case, and it will have been good to have considered it at the design stage rather than in the courtroom. So get comfortable with worst case analysis. Most design organizations do average case analysis rather than worst case analysis. Develop a proficiency to test both use cases and to test actual algorithmic systems, both amongst themselves and in these hybrid environments where there's humans hanging around too, and get the right set of eyes on the problem, and allow people to raise the kinds of issues that we've been talking about today, and even issues that none of us have even thought about yet.
So I kind of not so secretly wish that Chainsaw Roomba hashtag would go trend right now, because I just really enjoy Chainsaw Roomba so very much. Thank you, Bob. We've heard some really actionable advice from Anna, in respect to her research as well, and Bob did the kind deed of filling the corporate side of the typical kind of corporate advice. So thanks so much for that, and for Chainsaw Roomba, which we'll take with us, Bob. And Robin, I wonder if you could share a little bit with us, and we'll just note you are in the nonprofit sector as well now. So what are your particular actionable thoughts walking away?
Thanks, Joni. Well, I think that we are dealing with a number of different constituencies here, and so I've picked out 3 of those, and I have some thoughts a thought for each of them. I think as users of these systems, we need to recognize that there's no free ride here. We need to reclaim agency where agency is taken away from us. And we need to do that by developing our awareness so that we can make intelligent and informed choices. So for the users, reclaim your agency. I think for those deploying this kind of system, we've talked about ethics a bit, and I hinted at some of the shortcomings of the 2 basic ethical models, the utilitarian and the rules-based. I think deployers of this sort of system need to be thinking about the fairness of what they do. They need to be thinking, okay, when I make a choice as to whether the system is going to do A or B, which of those is actually fairer? Not just better for me, but which is fairer to the users as well, and to be taking their interest as stakeholders more fully into account. So for the deployers, it's about ethics and fairness. And then for the developers, I'm going to go back. If what Bob wants from Santa is a chainsaw-wielding, tree-trimming Roomba, what I want from Santa is intelligent user agents. I want the device intelligence that is on all of our desks and in all of our pockets and around all of our wrists to be put more effectively to use, expressing and enforcing our privacy preferences.
Very good. So list to Santa or the character of your choice grows. So Steve, your actionable thought and wishes for any type of gift for you on your particular holiday.
Just to echo what Anna said about machines making decisions on our behalf and so on. The the additional spin on that is that when we have big data processes, for example, that are divining insights about people from raw data and working out what people's preferences are without ever having to bother them with questions, it's like they're mind reading, and we need to make sure that these algorithms are held to the same standards of privacy, because when you synthesize personal information instead of asking someone directly, you're still accountable. So I think that's a really important point. Look, my call to action, if you like, the one thing I'm concerned about in practice is verification and testing. I think that we need to have some real grassroots reform about software development practices. You know, we talk about the world being eaten by software. Well, the world is being eaten by spaghetti code at the moment. It's just appalling, the sort of crap that's out there running on computers. And if we allow that same sort of spaghetti code to get into cars and medical devices and refrigerators and algorithmic stock trading, then of course catastrophe looms. So we need to pay more attention to testing and verification in particular. A little bit of a sort of a funny horror story. People would have seen recently that the object recognition algorithms that are available on some of these cloud photo album services have gone a little bit awry. And there's a horrible scenario where people of certain ethnicity are actually being identified as apes in these object recognition situations. It's just appalling at every level. Some of the sober analysis of this suggests that the people that are writing the object recognition software are so used to white male faces that they might not have the cultural diversity, you know, in their makeup to think outside the box, to think outside of their own personal experience, and to write object recognition algorithms that are more universal. So I think that's a great point. It's about the bias that people are carrying with them when they're developing this stuff. I make the observation that if those same biases were also affecting testers, then we've got real disasters looming. You'll have a double error where software is written with tunnel vision, and then it's being tested by people with the same sort of cultural biases, and the test cases maybe are escaping attention. So when we start to think about these, you know, the paradigmatic Internet of Things and paradigmatic algorithm cases of self-driving cars, I just think in practical terms we need to be coming out with test cases that are creative and are unbiased. You know, we need to think about what happens when these cars drive in really unfamiliar neighbourhoods with really unfamiliar environmental cues. It's those unexpected inputs that always kill an algorithm, right? And sadly, an algorithm that goes wrong in a car is going to kill people. So you know, call for reform and much greater care and I guess humility in the way that we start to test these things and apply our experiences and our community standards to how these things work in practice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. You know, you remind me that diversity is a key factor of humanity. So that's, I think that's been an issue in many systems, as you say, and you know, carries over its impact into algorithmic access control as well. And you know, diversity is a key factor of humanity, and IEEE is an organization focusing on technology for humanity. And so I think this is all, you know, very appropriate. And I wanted to say that I very much appreciate the panelists taking their time today. I've had the opportunity to work with the panelists in different capacities over the last 10 years or so, and you always teach me something new. So thanks to each of you for sharing your personal thoughts today on the topic. The Twitter conversation can continue, so if you are watching this at any time, you'd like to tweet using the hashtag IEEE Net Policy, we would be happy to connect with you on Twitter and discuss personal views. So thank you so much for those of you who are watching now and may watch later. I wanted to also make a quick mention that inadvertently and unplanned, Robin had mentioned earlier a South by Southwest panel around consent that we had worked together to put in, and so if you do see that, you know, you can feel free to to vote. But what I'd also like to call your attention to is that IEEE has had a presence at South by Southwest for a number of years now. So if you are interested in the South by Southwest environment and you search the panel picker, you can find many great panels that IEEE has put together as well. And I'm sure our panelists may be involved in other panels. I don't know. So vote away if that interests you. Finally, I'd like to thank the technical team at IEEE for putting this event on. They are always extremely helpful. We thank you guys for that. And I'd like to thank the family of IEEE organizations for supporting technology for humanity and live panels such as this. And I will leave you again with the IEEE Internet Initiative. That's internetinitiative.ieee.org for those of you who'd like to learn more. So thanks again for your time. We hope you enjoyed this very high-level discussion. We invite you to continue to participate on Twitter and to enjoy the many live panels that IEEE hosts on an array of topics. So thanks everyone for your time and participation, and we will see you at the next live panel.